Hi everyone, welcome back. We've just covered a little bit of the notion of typological distinctions that come out in the analysis of phonemic contrasts in languages. So we can now turn away from simple analytical procedures to some more abstract theoretical questions. Now that we've acquired in practice this skill of phonemic analysis by using the method of local context, looking for complementary distributions, looking for minimal pairs, we can ask the question whether these phonemes that we're positing in our analysis whether these are merely an analytical convenience for linguists, or whether these phonemes, which are discoverable through their procedures that I've just named, have psychological reality for speakers. And moreover, how can we then know that the analyses that we've developed are correct? And how can we know if speakers indeed have this notion of contrastive and non-contrastive sounds that, at least at the level of linguists, seems to be true? So I'll first mention some experimental evidence, and then we'll talk about some other basis for thinking that indeed speakers do have this notion of contrastive, do possess this notion of contrastive and non-contrastive sounds, and in concrete cases that seems to correspond to the analyses that linguists are able to develop. So in a little bit to cite some experimental evidence here, there are experiments that have been done with babies being raised in a purely monolingual context. So their primary linguistic data has been from only essentially a single language. And that suggests that by the age of about 9 or 10 months, the babies are no longer sensitive to phonetic differences between sounds that are not phonemically contrastive in the languages that they are acquiring. This suggests that already relatively early on, the brains of babies are trying to build neural pathways to focus in on the sounds and the contrasts that they think are important. And as we'll see later on, there are also experiments that suggest that speakers do have intuitions about what sounds are the same and not the same. And for native speakers, it seems to consistently be the case that sounds which are the same in their estimation are sounds that are not phonemically contrastive. Other research done with infants suggests that infants already also have a good idea of phoneme boundaries by about 10 months of age, when they lose the ability to hear subtle non-phonemic distinctions. So the co-articulation of sounds, the way in which the gesture of articulation from one sound to another sometimes causes sounds to somewhat bleed together. And if you have the effect of listening to a language that you've never studied before, never heard before, it may not be entirely clear to you where one sound begins and another distinct sound ends. And that seems to be the case for babies, but again, by the age of 10 months, because those babies are developing an idea of what the contrastive sounds their language are, by that age of 10 months, they are also relatively good at identifying where one sound, one contrastive unit in their phonological system ends and another one begins. And to give some examples of this difficulty in perceiving sounds that are not phonemically contrastive, we can look at some sounds which are certainly distinctive or phonemic in some languages, but for speakers of English and German, they're difficult to perceive. So on the one hand, the distinction between a velar voiceless stop ka and a voiceless uvular stop ka, and also the distinction between aspirated and unaspirated voiceless stops, using a bilabial stop here. So for instance, in a language indigenous to the Pacific Northwest of North America, Thompson Salish, we can find minimal pairs showing that a velar stop and a voiceless uvular stop are contrastive. These are both also ejective sounds in this case. That's not so crucial. And in Hindi, we can find instances of contrast between aspirated and unaspirated stops. So we have the word pal with an unaspirated voiceless stop, but pal with an aspirated voiceless stop. And native speakers of English or German would find it generally quite difficult to say what the difference is. Phonetically untrained native speakers to say what the difference between sounds in these couple of cases would be. We can also gather some evidence for the genuineness of phonemic intuitions from a few further domains, which I will walk us through in a moment. So first we'll look at some sameness intuitions, then writing systems, and finally phonological transfer effects of loan words. That is how, when a word from one language enters another language, how that word comes to be pronounced. So as I've mentioned above, speakers do seem to have intuitions about what sounds are the same. And as I said, the same, when native speakers say that two sounds are the same, it means that those two sounds are not phonemically contrasted. And speakers are generally good at picking out phonemic sameness, this property of sameness, by looking for rhyming or near minimal pairs, in the same way that we, in our analyses, have looked for similar local environments. So we can look at a couple of examples from English and German. So compare, for instance, the words connection and confection. So in the stressed syllables, neck and beck, it seems clear that the vowel in those syllables would be perceived as the same by native speakers of most varieties of English. But the vowel in the words tough and cough, those are different vowels. We have an unrounded mid-low back vowel versus a rounded mid-low back vowel. And take the words phonology and morphology. Again, in the stressed syllable here, this vowel, I would say, is the same. And I think for speakers of most varieties, for speakers of standard German, we can find similar minimal pairs. So take the word stürzen and kürzen. There in the first syllable, the stressed syllable, we have a front lax, a high front lax rounded vowel, Ö, and that seems to be the same vowel, whereas the vowel in the words tal and toll are clearly distinct vowels. And you can take the parallels to English phonology and morphology, phonology and morphology, and the vowel in the stressed syllable, E, seems clearly to be the same vowel. So these rhyming pairs give an indication of saying, yeah, that's the same vowel, and if it's the same vowel, as opposed to cases in which there's something clearly different, that gives an idea of what things don't contrast and what things do contrast with one another. If we come now to writing systems, here the point is essentially that the writing systems, especially alphabetic writing systems, are usually pretty good indicators of phonemic contrasts in languages. And the fact that there are plenty of orthographic systems, plenty of alphabetic systems that were created prior to the advent of modern linguistics that pretty closely follow the principle of having a single symbol or combination of symbols for a single phoneme, can be taken as evidence that for the creator, for the native speaker developers or adapters of that alphabet, they're looking for representation of what the contrastive sounds of the language would be. So if we have native speakers inventing orthographic systems, they seem to usually find it easiest to create spelling systems that represent phonemes. There are, on the other hand, there are interesting cases in which you have orthographies represented created for languages that were no longer really spoken natively. A good example is the alphabet invented for the Avestan language, which seems to represent a lot of fine phonetic detail that no true native speaker of Avestan would have created. It's because the Avestan language, by the time an alphabet for it was invented, was purely a liturgical language. There were no longer native speakers of the language. Native speakers of Avestan had developed into Middle Persian by that point. So the result was an alphabet which didn't represent the purely phonemic contrast, but represented a lot of fine phonetic detail. And here we can go to make a short excursus into the pretty horrible, from the perspective of most native speaker children and a lot of non-native speaker learners of English, the pretty horrible standard orthography of English, which seems relative compared to the orthographies for many other languages, seems to be consistently bad at representing its phonemes in a predictable fashion. And this has historical reasons. One major reason is that the orthography was invented when the orthography that is more or less still used was invented when the phoneme inventory was totally different, especially the vowels. And indeed, the current English orthography was pretty good at representing the phonemes, the vowel phonemes of Middle English prior to the so-called Great Vowel Shift. So, for instance, probably read that the typical spelling convention of two E's, two vowels in English, in Middle English, that would have represented a long A. As you might expect, the vowel signs A in many Romance languages indicate some kind of vowel like A, and for English this was the case too, but through the Great Vowel Shift, the vowel long A then became the high vowel long E, and through this series of vowel shifts we end up with an orthography that looks rather strange. And what complicates the situation even more is that, yeah, there are many loan words from Latin, Romance languages, and ancient Greek, which tend to be faithful to the original orthography of those languages. The words tend to be spelled more or less as they are in Latin or French or ancient Greek. So this creates a multitude of symbols for representing the same phoneme. So the fact, for instance, that the phoneme of a labiodental fricative th can be represented orthographically, signs like th and th is a consequence of this very effect. So sometimes you may hear linguistically naive persons who make statements like Spanish or Italian spelling is phonetic. What they're saying when they say phonetic here, what they're actually meaning is that orthographic systems of languages like Italian very well and Spanish to a somewhat lesser degree do a very good job of representing what the distinctive phonemes of those languages are. And it certainly makes no sense to say that the orthography is phonetic. So Spanish has a phoneme, b, which has the allophone v, and in Spanish, this phoneme, whether it is realized as the stop b or the fricative v, can be spelled with one of two different signs. So this is the orthography would be more phonemic if one of these signs for Spanish were eliminated and only one were used. This again has historical reasons, in part because of the way in which sounds from Latin developed. There are, interestingly, some dialects, like the dialect of Spanish spoken in Los Angeles, that seem to have created a new phoneme of a voiced labiodental fricative, which may be something of a transfer effect through knowledge of English combined with spelling pronunciations. So speakers of Spanish there who know English well and know that there's a phoneme v in English, then transfer that to pronouncing words spelled with the sign, with this sign as a voiced labial dental fricative. And as an instance of good phonemic spelling, we can take one case in Italian, where many dialects of Italian have a phoneme which should be represented as an alveolar sibilant fricative, s, always spelled with this sign, but it has two allophones, a voiced and a voiceless allophone, which, as I've said, are consistently represented with the same sign. So this represents a good case in which two allophones of the same phoneme are represented with a single sign corresponding to that phoneme. And at the end of this lecture, well, when we talk about contextually limited contrast of nasals, we can see that this also corresponds to the same phonemic principle. So as our last sort of evidence for the psychological reality of phoneme, we can look at some examples of the transfer of sounds from one language to another. Let's take a few classic examples. So, for instance, the personal name of the mathematician Gödel in German is realized by many native speakers of English as something like girdle, with a tap and a different lateral sound at the end of a word. So there are a lot of things that have to occur here. So English has no front rounded vowels like ü, so something has to be done differently there. It has to map onto some other phoneme of English, and for a lot of native speakers of English, that seems to be this sort of rhotic schwa, and English has some allophonic rules that end up applying to the sounds of a voiced coronal stop and a lateral approximant that cause those to be realized differently. So the stop between vowels before an unstressed syllable becomes a tap in American English, while the L has to be realized as a dark L, as a velarized L at the end of a syllable. We saw instances of that in last week's lecture. Another example, if the word waffle, pronounced by English speakers, is adapted by Finnish speakers, there's a host of sounds, a glide wa, a mid-low back rounded vowel o, fricative voiceless labiodental fricative fa, and a schwa. Those are changed in a number of ways. So for instance, the glide wa is changed into a va. And one last case, the English word automobile in American English pronunciation, as adopted by the Iroquoian language Menominee, has to undergo a number of changes. Since this language has no liquids or voiced stops, each one of the liquids or voiced stops has to be substituted. So let's take the tap, ra, in American English, which is substituted by a corresponding coronal stop, and the voiced stop, ba, is substituted by the corresponding voiceless stop. So what these phonological transfer effects seems to show us is that each phoneme that doesn't occur in the borrowing language needs to be replaced by a native phoneme. So as long as the speakers in the receiving language don't have very good or detailed command of the sounds or phonemic inventory of the language providing the word, then one phoneme will need to be transformed into a possible phoneme of the other languages. And as we saw in the adaptation of German Gödel to English girdle, which frankly sounds horrible, I have to say, we see the application of some allophonic rules. So not only is there a mapping of one phoneme onto another phoneme, but it's difficult for speakers to avoid applying relevant allophonic rules once they've decided. So for the native speakers of American English, it's totally possible to map this the sound of a voiced coronal stop onto the phoneme of a voiced alveolar stop in English, but because of the position of that stop in the word gödel, for speakers of American English, it's very difficult to not apply the allophonic process of tapping and thereby generate the tap ra in that word. So what are our larger implications then? So we now have this criterion of phonological reality, and we can think about whether the assessments of phonemic status of a sound should be partly substance-based, whether they should depend somewhat on the sounds themselves. So thus far, when trying to decide what the phonemes of a language are, what the underlying sound is, that has been based exclusively on the distributions of sounds. So our question here is, to what extent, our question here is as follows. To what extent should the phonetic properties of sounds or the intuitions of native speakers influence phonological analyses? One famous case here involves the glottal fricative ha, like at the beginning of the word help, for instance, and the velar nasal like at the end of the word bring. Help and bring. Let's transcribe those briefly. I'll avoid putting in a velarized L here for the moment. And in the word bring, there we have a velar nasal at the end of the word. What turns out to be the case is that these two sounds are, in fact, in a complementary distribution in English. And I think that the same largely holds for Standard German as well. So our usual criterion has been to say that when two sounds occur in complementary distribution, we would want to say that they are allophones of the same phoneme. So by the criterion of complementary distribution, we would have some phoneme which has these allophones. Now, just to demonstrate this briefly, let's talk about the distribution of these two sounds. So we can find the glottal fricative in English at the beginning of a word, as in here, before a stressed syllable word immediately, as in the verb adhere, or in ahead. In adhere, it's also important to note that it follows a consonant. Whereas the velar nasal occurs at the end of a word preceding a consonant, as in hunger, and occurs between, can occur before an unstressed syllable, as in a word like thingy. So these two sounds are in a purely complementary distribution, but the intuition that native speakers of English have is that these two sounds are distinct and contrasting. So, for instance, we could remark that a word like near in English, that would be phonotactically illicit. So the phonotactic constraints of English would say that's a phonologically ill-formed word, but insofar as it would be possible to have a word near in English, I think native speakers would have the intuition that that would mean to be a different word than the word here. And let's also keep in mind, here's the substance-based criterion, that these two sounds are phonetically quite different from one another. Whereas in the cases that we've looked at so far, the allophones of a single phoneme tend to be fairly similar phonetically to one another. So this result seems to suggest that maybe pure complementary distribution as a criterion might not be a totally perfect guide for deciding upon the phonemes of a language. Maybe it is not a sufficient condition alone in order to class two phones as allophones. Maybe what we need is this substance-based criterion of phonetic similarity and the distributional criterion of complementary distributions in order for two sounds to be classed as a speaker as belonging to the same phoneme. Okay, so I hope that this evidence that we've gone through in this section provides relatively convincing reasons to believe that indeed the analyses that we are carrying out as linguists, as phonologists, indeed correspond to something actually seated in the brains of speakers. When we come back, we'll look at a couple of further concepts you'll need for possibly applying in some further exercises and in homework assignments.